The transport sector is evolving to meet the needs of the net zero era. Its future depends on integration and sustainability through clean energy such as hydrogen and batteries. This is vital to Britain's infrastructure, and that's where expert legal advice from Freeths can prove integral to your success. A top 50 commercial law firm, Freeths Transport sector team has specialists in the core areas of rail, bus and coach, road and aviation, together with freeports and ports and marines. We regularly provide advice on transport-related infrastructure projects and regulatory compliance in areas such as railway station and depot leasing and redevelopment, and the implementation of bus franchising and enhanced partnerships, alongside new roads and highways schemes and vehicle procurement and maintenance, and significant airport redevelopment and expansion projects. Our free-thinking approach delivers tailor-made legal guidance for you. Freeths Transport. Solutions today for tomorrow.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for what I hope will be an engaging panel discussion on the journey to net zero for a sustainable transport system. This will be the first webinar in a series, and in future webinars we'll be doing a bit more of a deeper dive into the transport sector and different modes and also other related hot topics. For today, our focus is on the decarbonisation of vehicles and transport infrastructure, and looking at the key regulatory and commercial drivers to net zero in the face of significant industry and regulatory change, which is ongoing and forthcoming. We'll try and keep the panel session to around 40 to 45 minutes to allow some time for some Q&A at the end. So please do interact and ask questions. There's a Q&A box. If you could try and use the Q&A box rather than the chat, and I'll come back to those at the end and we'll pick up some of your questions. Please also get in touch if there's any future topics you'd like us to cover. We'd love to hear from you. And as ever, do contact any member of the panel if there's anything covered today that you'd like to discuss in more detail. And just quickly, I want to highlight there is lots of content available on our website. We've got a designated transport sector page. We've got a separate ultra low emissions vehicle page with lots of resources on there and linked to today's topic. We've also got an energy waste sustainability page with lots of pre-recorded webinars on there, which you can watch at your leisure. So first, to introduce the panel, I'll ask each panelist to quickly introduce themselves. I'll start with myself. So I'm an infrastructure and transport lawyer with a property background and a crossover into the energy sector, hence my particular interest in net zero and today's topic. I joined Freeths coming up for 3 years ago, and I chair our national transport practice, and my key focus areas are rail and bus. If I can ask Iain to introduce yourself, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Iain Bowler. I'm a partner in the commercial group. Unfortunately, my journey in the transport sector started with bus privatisation in the mid-1980s. Gives you a bit of a clue. Went through into rail privatisation, rail concessioning, and then a significant amount of rolling stock procurement ever since.
Thank you, Iain. And Shashi next, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Shashi Chambers. I'm a partner in the Milton Keynes office. I undertake a range of real estate, commercial and projects work for airports, including contracts relating to the terminal building, services in and out of the airport, and airport development and expansion.
Thank you, Shashi. Next to Frank, please.
Good morning. It's great to be part of this. And my role is as a commercial director within our commercial team. I've experience in both rail and bus privatisation, a bit like Iain. And my interest in bus actually started earlier than that, having a job as a bus conductor during my summer holidays, which was a brilliant job, I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And Rob?
Good morning, I'm Robert Bruce. I'm a planning partner. We do a lot of development consent order projects, particularly in the road sector, although also airports, rail and other areas.
Thank you, Rob. And finally, Rhianna.
Morning, everyone. I'm Rhianna Wilsher. I'm a director in our Bristol office, and I'm a member of our energy waste and sustainability team specialising in clean energy and helping clients with all kinds of energy procurement, whether it's purchasing it, using it efficiently, and generating their own energy. Done quite a lot of work for the transport sector, assisting airports, etc., with their electricity and heat needs.
Thank you all. So now to kind of move on to the panel session, we've got four kind of questions to structure today's sort of discussion, and I'm going to put each of those questions to 3 or 4 of our panelists to discuss. So the first question: why is decarbonisation of transport important? You know, why are we here today, and why are we talking about it? And if I can first put that question to Iain to discuss the importance of decarbonisation in UK rail.
Thanks, Michael. So it goes without saying that climate change is seen as a real threat. And in 2019, the government set legislative targets to achieve net zero in terms of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And reducing carbon emissions in rail is a key part of that plan. Rail's already a very green mode of transport, lots of electric trains running around the country, but further decarbonising rail will bring additional benefits both to the rail industry and also to across the whole of the transport sector and the wider economy. And in rail specifically, a number of measures are being implemented to try to get to net zero faster than 2050. DfT, for example, has asked the rail industry to look at ways of removing all diesel-only units from service by 2040 in England and Wales. And in Scotland, the Scottish government has set that target at 2035. And part of this approach, of course, involves Network Rail, and Network Rail has issued its own transport decarbonisation network strategy. And there are many facets in the rail industry that can make a significant contribution to decarbonisation and to the green recovery. So we look at stations redevelopment, depot construction, using sustainable technologies, both in the construction and operation of stations and depots. But the main focus for today, at least in relation to what I'm speaking about, is on rolling stock. As I've said, there's already a lot of electric rolling stock on the British rail network, but there are also still a lot of diesel units, what are referred to as DMUs, that will need to be replaced between now and 2040. I think the latest numbers I was able to get my hands on suggest that there's something like 2,600 DMUs that are still in the UK fleet that will need to be replaced by 2040. And also, there are a significant number of existing electric units that are also going to become life expired over the same period of time, something like 2,750 units, existing electric units. And this presents a significant opportunity for the rail industry to clean its act up even further in the post-Williams Shap era. And really to take the lead, I think, in the drive for a more sustainable and green mode of travel in the future. I think in this hyper-vigilant, ESG-orientated world that we live in, consumers want to see that the choices they make, including choice of transport, promoting green and sustainable outcomes and helping get to net zero. And I think rolling stock replacement will play a major part in further promoting rail as a clean choice of travel, as rolling stock becomes cleaner and more efficient, and ultimately, I think the intention or the belief is that will create a modal shift from road to rail, and this is coming about. We've seen the development of much more efficient diesel engines over the last decade or so. But we're also now firmly in the era of the IPEMU, the independently propelled electric multiple unit, or battery-powered trains, or as the railway industry likes to call them, because the rail industry loves its nomenclature, OBES, onboard energy systems for traction. I'm going to call them battery systems for trains, because you can see that I'm struggling to get my tongue around OBES. We're also seeing development of hydrogen traction being introduced into the rail industry, and we'll say more about, or I'll say more about hydrogen traction a little later on in the session. Thanks, Michael.
And thank you, Iain. I think that that outlines the business case very well, and also we'll come back to incentives and kind of how how we're going to make sure the industry does actually change. We know the problem, but how are we going to fix it? Thank you. If I can next ask the same question to Shashi, in the context of UK aviation, why is decarbonisation of air travel important?
Yeah, morning, Michael. It's a good question. In relation to aviation, actually, percentage-wise, it's a very small percentage of the overall greenhouse gas emissions, and if you take into account all the polluters as such. However, it's the future. The Climate Change Committee expects that the sector will become the second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, unless significant action is taken. So it's really about tackling the road ahead. So the government's response to this is Jet Zero. This is their commitment to achieve net zero within the UK aviation sector by 2050. So we all know that the government loves a consultation, and they've consulted on their Jet Zero strategy. They've also consulted on the UK domestic aviation sector to reach net zero by 2040, so a slightly shorter timescale for that. So how will the government achieve this? Well, the government set up the Jet Zero Council, which is a partnership between industry and government that brings together ministers, leaders in aviation and academics to drive development of new technologies and innovation to cut emissions. Overall, it is a good idea. My view is that the government can't do it alone. They don't obviously have the experience and the expertise, the R&D capability, and equally the aviation and aerospace sector itself will definitely need government's help in terms of setting out the regulatory infrastructure and also, where relevant, providing funding for design and research. So the Net Zero Council will focus on developing UK capabilities to deliver net zero technologies by focusing on 3 areas, and they're obviously technology driven. Firstly, developing and industrialising zero emission aviation and aerospace technologies. Secondly, establishing UK production facilities for SAFs, sustainable aviation fuels, and commercialising that industry by driving down production costs and making it easier to transport fuels. And lastly, developing a coordinated approach to the policy and regulatory framework that will be required and is much needed to deliver net zero aviation by 2050. A specific example of that is the Flyzero Project. So this is a £15 million 12-month research study into the potential for developing commercial aircraft that don't emit carbon emissions by 2030. So this is the roadmap to zero carbon emission aircraft, and they're looking at the design challenges, the manufacturing demands, operational requirements, and the market opportunity of potential carbon zero emission aircraft concepts. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Shashi. And Frank, can I move on to you next for why should we be talking about, I suppose, the decarbonisation of the UK bus sector?
Yeah, this is what I'm going to look at. I mean, I think we all would agree that travel by bus is incredibly important within the United Kingdom. The rail network that Iain has talked about has clearly got its geographic limitations, and therefore many people, if they look to public transport, they look to bus as their way of getting about. So it's serving a really valuable social and economic benefit to our, both to our communities and to our economy. You need buses in many cases to get to work. You need buses to get to hospitals. You need buses to get to social events. And we shouldn't forget the coach sector. And I'm going to try and emphasise quite a bit in these presentations, the coach sector, because it's often overlooked, because coach is there for long distance travel and for many other purposes, mainly leisure, of course. The statistics for 2019-20, which are the latest ones available to me, suggest that more than 4 million journeys by bus were travelled in England alone in 2019-2020. Now, the consequences for our environment are equally significant in a negative way, unfortunately, and the last statistics available suggest that 3% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to bus and coach travel, so that clearly is not good. Bus services in our country are universally provided by the private sector, and there are numerous operators across the country. All are obviously welcome to make their own investment decisions at the present time, And to date, I think it's fair to say there's been little intervention in the market. Bus operators will typically apply a practice of cascading their vehicles. You will probably find the best quality buses in urban areas, and then the operators, when they're operating services in rural areas, they may then move the buses out into the rural areas that they serve. You will then find that they come onto the market. There's almost a supply chain of passenger vehicles, with other operators then picking them up when the larger operators want to divest and invest in new vehicles. And so we've got a perpetual system in place that, if we reflect on the fact that petrol and diesel as a source of propulsion is meant to be eliminated, well, certain new vehicles will not be on the market after 2040, I think it is, then clearly something has got to happen to accelerate, if you like, the investment within the sector. And that's important because, again, quoting a statistic, at the moment it's understood that there's probably only about 2%. I suspect that number will have increased because there is now, of course, a practice of investing in zero-emission vehicles. But only 2% at the last statistics available to me were zero-emission. When you break that figure down and split it between London and elsewhere, you find actually in London that the figure is 4% and the number elsewhere 1%. And I wonder if the fact that London bus services are regulated in a different way to the rest of the country, with Transport for London playing a significant role in influencing the standards of service and so on, is important to that. And indeed, the new tendering process, the latest tendering processes that Transport for London are initiating, because the operators have to re-tender for routes every now and again, and they're now specifying zero-emission vehicles as a requirement of the tendering process. So there's quite a bit of a challenge for areas, particularly outside London, but for London as well. Now, what's the Department for Transport doing to address these issues? Well, this gets quite interesting, because round about this time last year, a long-awaited policy on local transport by bus was launched in the form of the Bus Back Better policy. And of course, that was launched to a backdrop of the pandemic and the massive reduction in patronage of buses that occurred because of the pandemic. But there were two challenges for the industry. One is to build back patronage to levels it was at before, and to push on and encourage more people to travel by bus and less by passenger car, for example. So the DFT is addressing that issue in a way that I'll have a chance to talk about in a bit more detail later. Another pressure point, and I talked about the greenhouse gas emissions that diesel vehicles cause. Well, there's environmental considerations obviously come into play, and through the processes of looking at the extent to which there's pollution within urban areas, and now that pinch points have been identified, there's been a lot of emphasis on environmental considerations and having clean air zones where buses, as operators of diesel vehicles, are clearly a key player in that. And so there's a number of initiatives at the present time across the country. They vary in their nature to attempt to reduce the and effectively try to get operators not to operate diesel vehicles within certain areas. And these are the kind of issues that are being tackled at the present time. What does this mean? Well, it certainly means that we're moving towards a period when diesel operated vehicles will no longer have a place in our transport sector, and that has to be a good thing. But the key question obviously is how quickly that can happen. Do we have a manufacturing base to actually do this? Again, that's something that I'd like to look at later on in the presentation. And certainly, I think we'll need to see more in the way of a route towards zero emission vehicles within the bus sector in the next few years. Greater emphasis, I think, by government on intervention in the market, and they are doing things at the present time, such as the project, which is bringing about 4,000 buses into the sector in a project way over the next few years, because local authorities are currently bidding for ZEBRA funding. but only certain authorities will actually get that funding, obviously. There is a pot of £1.3 billion of additional investment funding available and committed by Treasury, and that's going into what are called enhanced partnerships, where again, much of that money, with a bit of luck, can go towards investment in zero emission buses. So there's certainly a lot to do in the sector. As I said at the beginning, it's incredibly important to both our economy and to society as a whole that we do find ways of making sure there are public sector vehicles available on the streets, serving the public, and certainly after 2040, when diesel engines will no longer have a place.
Brilliant, thank you, Frank. Clearly a hell of a lot going on there, but we'll, as you say, we'll come back to kind of incentives and how that might be achieved a bit later on. And before I move on to Rhianna to take that first question, I just remind everyone, if you want to raise questions for the panel, which I'll pick up at the end, can you try and use the Q&A function in Zoom, because my multitasking skills are are limited. It's great to see the chat, and I've already had more questions in than I thought I'd get in total, so it's great to see. So please carry on asking questions, but try and use the Q&A chat rather than the general chat function, but whichever one everyone can see and contribute to. Thank you. And Rhianna, can I come to you next then on kind of your view on the importance of decarbonisation of the transport sector, and also with your energy experience to highlight some of the green energy schemes and funding that's available?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Michael. So there's obviously a huge amount of support from government towards decarbonising transport. And as we've heard from a number of different speakers, it's incredibly important for a number of reasons. I won't go over them again now, but government's kind of hitting it from all angles, whether that's through personal choice in the, walking, or use the types of cars that we drive and the types of transport that we take, or whether that's funding towards installing additional infrastructure, clean infrastructure, also in a lot of the research and development, particularly around new fuels, and of course in relation to renewable generation. For example, clean electricity and clean heat, when we're talking about solar and wind example, that has been ongoing for a number of decades now, and there has been a huge amount of government support and funding for that, which over the last couple of years has fallen away because of the success that we've had in it. So for example, the feed-in tariffs for solar generation have gone, the renewable obligation certificates, the ROCs have gone as well, and the renewable heat incentive for renewable heat has fallen away as well. So government at the moment is in a bit of a pinch because of the electricity crisis and the cost of living at the moment, not to put further green levies on top of already very expensive energy bills at the moment. But there is still some focus, rather than kind of the wider generation and use of electricity and heat. There's still some focus in the transport sector, taking electric vehicles, for example, on a personal level, and the affordability of road vehicles and subsidies for that, which apply to individuals, but also fleet cars and vans. Installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure as well. There's an awful lot of funding available for that. If you want to put in lots of SMEs, charities, local authorities, providing subsidies for that. Research and development, of course, for road vehicles in terms of batteries, fuel cells, electronics. Aviation, we heard about the green fuels, green skies, and the Future Flight Challenge, which fund research and development into that. And of course, then we've got the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund as well, which is helping R&D for hydrogen and getting that off the ground. There's also kind of public sector support at that level as well. So the ZEBRA, which is the Zero Emissions Bus Regional Area Scheme, and the local government support programme. So really, there's a lot of funding out there, not necessarily for renewable generation, but for to incentivise us to install clean infrastructure and to use clean options as well.
Thank you, Rhianna. So next, to kind of move on to our second question, which is kind of, what does decarbonisation actually mean? We've touched on quite a lot of this already, but specifically in the context of transport infrastructure and buildings, as opposed to vehicles, which we'll come on to in our next question, and kind of touching on some of the practical and regulatory hurdles that might inhibit bringing some of these ideas to fruition in the transport sector, which is much heavily regulated than some of the other sectors that we are used to. If I can ask Shashi first that question to discuss in the context of airports and airport operators?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, in relation to aviation, the obvious difficulty here, of course, is our insatiable demand for air travel. Yeah, granted, we've had the pandemic and that has grounded planes for a couple of years. But prior to that, the trajectory was only heading one way. And, you know, the bounce back is expected to be relatively strong going forward from this year onwards. So that demand for travel, coupled with the fact that our current airport infrastructure has been creaking for many years, gives us a sort of a difficulty when we look at the challenges that decarbonisation brings us. Airports have really struggled to cope with the demand and capacity issues that exponential passenger growth prior to the pandemic brought us. We've certainly been left behind when you compare us to some of the other countries in the world and some of the super airports that have cropped up, you know, in the Far East and also in the Middle East. So prior to the pandemic, virtually all UK airports were subject to some sort of expansion or development programme. And obviously, expansion of airports doesn't sit naturally with decarbonisation. In fact, quite the opposite. And I think one of the audience have sent through a question on exactly that point. So more passengers, more employees, more cars travelling to and from the airport, more aircraft, more flights during the course of the day, more shops, concessions, facilities, more construction, yet less carbon. How does that work? So that is the real difficulty and the real challenge for the sector. The proposed third runway at Heathrow is, of course, a prime example of that. Heathrow has committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. However, if you believe those who oppose the runway, they will tell you that the proposed runway is completely incompatible with that target. So it presents a huge difficulty. Of course, construction can be undertaken in a sustainable way, and there's no doubt that planning requirements and construction methods have changed in recent years and continue to change to reflect that, whether it's more sustainable materials, more sustainable construction methods, and the requirement imposed by planning authorities or the Secretary of State by way of planning conditions to ensure a more sustainable scheme. There are certain specific requirements in relation to airside works and works to the runway and taxiways in relation to CAP regulations, which provide a regulatory framework which sits on top of the existing framework, which can also present challenges in terms of undertaking that work in a sustainable way. Connectivity has obviously been a buzzword in the sector for a while, and airports are increasingly being forced to look at, either through the planning scheme or otherwise, getting passengers out of their cars and using more sustainable public transport options. A good example of this is the new DART system that's currently being installed at Luton Airport, for example. So this is their £200 million scheme connecting the terminal building to the mainline railway system that runs north to south in and out of London. The lower hanging fruit is, of course, in terms of what you can do at the moment with your current infrastructure. So introducing electric vehicles into the fleet, harnessing solar energy, increased recycling, looking at fuel efficiency, replacing older heating ventilation systems, reducing, eliminating waste, etc. So these sorts of measures are already at the forefront of airport operators, and they're delivering results today, albeit, yeah, arguably they can go much further. All of the UK's major airports have already committed to achieve carbon neutrality, and some well before the government's target. Bristol Airport, for example, is committed to be carbon neutral for direct emissions by 2025, and Gatwick well before 2040. So work is underway, but you know, I do accept the questioning that actually more can be done and perhaps should be done. The difficulty for the aviation sector is during the last 2 years, it has been on its knees. So there's only so much pressure it can continue to bear.
Thank you, Shashi. If I could now ask the same question to Rob in the context of road and highways infrastructure and what decarbonisation means in that area.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, the starting point here is that the biggest emitter in the transport sector, by a large majority, is vehicles, and a significant majority of that is from private cars. You also have around 80% of freight transported by road. The government intends to fund around another 27 billion of road maintenance and expansion by national highways over the next 5 years. Added to that, of course, is the substantial money spent by councils on roads. The picture we get from that is that investing in roads and the use of private car is a vote winner. So there's challenges ahead on that. But we're not just talking about emissions from the use of the roads, we're also talking about the construction. The embedded emissions from construction is significant. I've seen in some of the Q&A questions we've received some people making similar points on, for example, the large amount of electricity needed for producing hydrogen, and therefore whether that's a sensible way forward in terms of fuel. Ideally, we need to be looking at shifting people to more sustainable modes of transport. I think we all agree on that: trains, buses, walking and cycling. Of course, some of that is about how we design and use the roads. So I think, yes, some modal shift is possible, but realistically, we're not going to stop, this is my view, people using their private car. So there are different views on modal shift. We've also seen that in some of the questions received in the Q&A. Some people have been making the point, particularly casting doubt on the shift from cars to rail due to the far greater investment in roads, and I've already outlined that, and also rising rail ticket prices and the comparative cost. The pandemic is also relevant here because there's been a greater car usage, and that's indicated by surveys, and that's due to continue. It suggests to me a large amount of the answer lies in electric cars and more sustainable modes of transport, for example, hydrogen buses. Government policy on levelling up is also relevant. We've seen the government recently cancel the Oxford to Cambridge Expressway. So where funding is deployed is likely to have an impact on the emissions and mitigation. I think in terms of hurdles, they are the familiar ones: planning delays and costs, compulsory acquisition, varying political support's a big one. I think that often wavers over time. We've seen that on the Oxford to Cambridge Expressway. And actually legal challenges now has become a big risk. That's a really big risk area which is emerging, I think, particularly from action groups. I can talk about that a bit later. But so the overall direction is clear. The government intends to build more roads and improving existing road infrastructure. So the inevitable consequence, I think, of that is we'll have to address the emissions in that context. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. That's really good. I mean, as you say, there's politics, costs, funding, incentives all behind the backbone of this. We can focus on why we should be doing it for the greater good, but actually, there's we operate in a thriving kind of economy. So next, I'm going to ask myself the same question in relation to decarbonisation of railway infrastructure, and I want to focus primarily on two aspects: rail station buildings, but also mainline electrification of the railways. So in terms of railway stations, there's an increasing desire to decarbonise the railway stations as part of the government's target we've talked about for a net zero rail network by 2050. And stations are part and parcel of the network, although I think if you look at the government's transport decarbonisation plan published last year, it was heavily focused on vehicles as opposed to buildings and infrastructure. In a 216-page report, I think, if my control F serves me right, there's only 19 uses for the word station in over 200 pages, and that includes bus stations, petrol stations, and railway stations. And for me, you need to include station buildings in our discussions to decarbonise the network in the true sense. So how do we incentivise that? I mean, there's questionably cost savings for private sector operators, the public sector infrastructure managers like Network Rail and TfL in getting this right and kind of reducing the operating costs of stations. But I think it's most likely going to be incentivised by a version of what were franchise commitments in the new national rail contracts. So as the rail franchises have been temporarily replaced during the pandemic, but eventually moved to national rail contracts, DfT can impose conditions on the private sector operators in return for awarding those rail services contracts. And that would cover most stations, because most stations in the UK are leased to operators. So doing it in that way would catch most of the stations that we see and use. Outside of that, you've got Network Rail managed stations. So Network Rail manages 20 of the largest stations, owns and operates. So like Birmingham New Street, London Paddington, for example. So Network Rail will be asking for additional funding to do any big sort of major refurbishment works to those stations. And that's obviously soon going to be transferred over from Network Rail to Great British Railways. And for other infrastructure managers as well, like Transport for London, they're also going to be needing more funding to try and implement some of these schemes at their stations. So what can we do to decarbonise our rail stations? And actually, it's good to see that, Shashi and I have got the similar list really in terms of airports and railway stations. I think this applies to almost all buildings in the transport sector, not just specific to rail. But I think our challenge with railway stations is these are large and open buildings. Many of them have outdoor spaces, uncovered platforms, some are listed, and all of this severely impacts on our ability to do major refurbishment works that have an impact. And the operators can look at things like reducing the operational energy use, increasing renewable energy supply from on-site or off-site sources, which Rhianna will talk about in a bit more detail later. Try and minimise waste, transform and reuse materials where we can. Carbon offsetting potentially, which I think Rhianna will pick up on a bit later as well. But kind of as Robert outlined for roads, it's construction as well as operating. So when we're building new stations and doing major refurbishment works, can we do that in a net zero way? It's not just about operations, it's the whole life of the asset that we need to be kind of thinking about. And in terms of electrification, I think the latest figures I could see is around about 40% of the UK rail network is currently electrified. It's a great starting point, but obviously there's still lots to do. There are plans afoot to fully electrify the whole of the network, but I'm a bit sceptical. I think that batteries and hydrogen trains may reduce the need to fully electrify all of the network. For example, a battery electric train will charge when running on the electrified routes, and where you've got gaps in electrification, they'll be able to run on battery power to kind of plug those gaps and then reconnect at the other end. So you might see the business case for 100% electrification diminish as these trains sort of become more commonplace. So finally, if I can put that question to Rhianna, please, for kind of your energy specialist view on the meaning of decarbonisation of the transport buildings and infrastructure, and also perhaps some of the regulatory hurdles.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Michael. So what can we do on our stations and our buildings and other infrastructure? Obviously, there is a huge need to decarbonise. We can look at reducing the way that we use our energy, and that can help reduce our energy costs and also help protect against price volatility if you're generating your own electricity as well, which is going to become more and more important. And obviously security of energy supplies as well, as you wanting to become less reliant on the national grid. So first, obviously, is if you want a quick and easy win to go green, you can purchase green electricity straight from a renewable source, such as a wind farm or a solar farm. And so the options are available for power purchase agreements now that you can really say are pure green because you're purchasing from there, albeit it has to go via the national grid to get to you, but you can be clear about where you're buying from. Electricity generation as well is an obvious one. That can be, the electricity can be, say, for example, solar, whether that's ground mounted alongside trackside, for example, on railways, or it could be roof mounted on the building itself. That electricity can then be reused into the building or for the infrastructure or for, say, powering electric vehicles. It can also, of course, be generated by wind power if there's space to do so, and combined heat and power, which is essentially burning something in order to produce both heat and electricity. That can sometimes be waste, or you can connect into a local source for that, like an energy from waste plant or a data center, for example. What makes electricity generation more viable is electricity storage, and we're seeing a huge uptake in the amount of storage that's being used, battery storage, that is. It's basically using the excess that's generated and either selling it or using it yourself when there's less generation. That helps smooth the intermittency, sorry, I get my teeth in, of renewable sources, which only work when the wind blows or when the sun shines. So it helps smooth that curve off. Heat and cooling as well, we don't want to forget those, because heat is 30% of our carbon emissions come from heat sources. And we'll be moving off our reliance on gas in the next 20 years. And so we have to look for other sources of heat generation, whether that's electrification and using heat pumps. But as Michael was saying, station buildings are often rather old. And so electrification heat pumps may not be suitable for those where they work at lower temperatures, unless it's a very efficient, warm, closed building. It's not going to be helpful there. So we might look at alternative fuels like biogas for boilers, or combined heat and power, as I said, kind of burning a material in order to generate heat and electricity. Also, rather innovatively, geothermal heat as well, literally putting big piles into the ground, can be useful for heat and cooling, and that's been done at the HS2 station at Euston Station. And then carbon offsetting is another becoming more and more popular at the moment with purchasing credits from projects that are sustainable around the world. They don't even have to be used in the UK, and those are freely tradable, just to show that your green credentials, although some see that as a little bit of greenwashing. I think the overriding message here is, if you're looking to use and generate your own electricity, you have to be very careful about the regulatory licensing requirements that sit with that. So there are licenses required for generation, distribution and supply of electricity, unless you fall within a class exemption. If you have multiple tenants, you may fall foul of supplying to multiple people. Heat, on the other hand, is completely unregulated for the time being, but it will become regulated in the next 3 years. So if you're thinking about generating yourself and supplying anybody else, you really do have to think about the regulatory requirements first.
Brilliant, thank you, Rhianna. So next, I think if we switch our focus on our third question and move away from kind of the buildings and the infrastructure and back to vehicles, and kind of what does decarbonisation mean in that context of the vehicles themselves and different propulsion technologies. And again, what are the potential complications with perhaps a turnkey vehicle procurement as these technologies become more commonplace? And if I can ask that question first to Iain, what decarbonisation means for you with rail rolling stock, and perhaps some consideration of some of the procurement issues.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, and I mean, I think lots to say in the context of rolling stock, and I think one of the questions we've also had through is it was questioning whether dual fuel fleets rather than electric only fleets is actually a suboptimal way to look at the future. And so hopefully I'll address that as I go through what I've got to say here. But I think what it is fair to say is that rail industry is addressing and embracing new traction technologies. I only need to go back 4 years really to 2017, when I advised Merseytravel on the purchase of their new fleet of Class 777 electric units for their Merseyrail Electrics network. Part of that procurement involved a pilot to develop one of the new Class 777s, which were electric units. They take the power from the third rail, a live third rail like the London Underground, but to develop that into an independently propelled electric unit. Why was that relevant? Why did they want to do that? Well, first of all, shunting third rail electric units around the depot. If you can remove the live third rail from the depot, that creates a far safer environment for maintenance staff. And also, Merseytravel have for a number of years, a lot of years, had plans to reopen previously closed sections of the former Merseyrail Electrics network, but the cost of electrifying those pieces of track were absolutely enormous. And therefore, to be able to run services on reopened branch lines using independently powered units was very attractive to Merseytravel. Still on the category of steel wheels, 2 years later on in 2019, CAF, the Spanish rolling stock manufacturer, signed a contract with Transport for West Midlands to deliver 21 battery-powered trams to Birmingham. And those third generation Urbo trams really provided a game changer for Birmingham, because frankly, they can operate without overhead catenary. And this also addresses the question about whether electric on mainline is the only viable solution, because I think if you can operate without overhead wires, you're able to facilitate extensions to the network, and this is certainly what Birmingham have found. They're looking at extending the tram network with the use of the battery-powered trams, because frankly it's a fraction of the cost of doing that if you don't have to put overhead wires up. And removing overhead wires removes a hugely complex and often controversial part of all previous tram schemes. Live power cables crisscrossing the city centre, attached to listed buildings and ugly street furniture, isn't the most attractive vista you can see in city centres. Particularly, many city centres are conservation areas, and you look at places like Florence, for example, where Hitachi are currently trialing their battery-powered tram. It's a significant move forward when you don't need to clutter city centres with all of this overhead wire. So the other thing that I think that comes through in the procurement, on the procurement side, Michael, you asked about procurement and turnkey projects, is that with battery-powered vehicles, and certainly with the hydrogen-powered vehicles, because of the new technology that's involved, I think what we're going to see are a lot more turnkey solutions, with OEMs providing maintenance, technical support, and also battery maintenance. So the deal, for example, between CAF and Travel West Midlands involves CAF providing technical support and battery maintenance services for the entire 30-year economic life of those vehicles. So I think in that respect, we're also seeing, staying on batteries for a moment, we're seeing battery-powered trains being introduced. I mentioned the pilot that Stadler are doing on the Class 777s on Merseyside, but also Hitachi are trialling a battery-powered train in the UK, and they currently operate the world's first complete battery-powered train fleet in Japan. So, but I think unlike passenger cars, unlike goods vehicles and buses and even trams, the entire solution for mainline train isn't just about battery-powered trains. I think that the priorities for a cleaner form of traction differ based on the usage and the different technical capabilities of the three main traction technologies that are being seen as the successor to diesel, which is electric, battery, and hydrogen. And I think the different technical capabilities of the operation of the rail network will sort of inform the choice of which of those technologies, or a combination of those technologies, works best. Currently, it's thought that battery and hydrogen are unsuitable for high-speed, long-distance passenger train services, and also for freight, just because of the amount of power that, if you think about a freight train, for example, the amount of power that requires can't be met by battery or hydrogen at the moment. Although it is interesting, going slightly off transport and into manufacturing, that actually JCB have been developing their hydrogen solution for their plant and equipment for a number of years now, because they saw from the outset that electric battery power wasn't going to be sufficient to give those vehicles the power draw they needed to work. So I think it probably is a matter of time before hydrogen generates the right levels of power. Electric's very versatile and can be applied across the whole range of rail applications. Urban trains that run up slower than 75 miles an hour, interurban that run up to 100 miles an hour, high speed that 125 miles an hour plus freight. So electric can do all of that. But the problem with electric is, it relies on fixed infrastructure, which is hugely expensive to install and also to operate, compared to the cost of operating a battery or a hydrogen powered unit. And so I think, to go I think to answer one of the questions that we've already been asked, that I believe that the adoption of bimode or multimode units, is likely to be the future. Almost a 300-ton equivalent of your Toyota Prius hybrid passenger car. But I keep mentioning hydrogen, hydrogen, I think, hydrogen is going to be extremely important in terms of mainline rail, and also probably trams in due course, but certainly mainline rail. Hydrogen power trains are already in use in Germany, in Austria, in France, and Alstom, with their Hydroflex, which they've developed in conjunction with Evershot Rail, has recently secured its first order for 10 hydrogen three-car hydrogen-powered units to be delivered to Scotland. Frank mentioned whether we've got the manufacturing infrastructure in the UK. Actually, just a slight digression, but Alstom are building those Hydroflex units in the UK, and Siemens, Hitachi, and CAF all have developed manufacturing plants in the UK, which are all looking at battery and hydrogen-powered units. So I think the manufacturing base is being built back into the UK in terms of mainline rail. So I think for those different rail categories of rail, the combination of these new modes of transport will provide a sort of horses for courses approach. Obviously, the lack of refueling capability in the UK at the moment will be an issue in terms of hydrogen-powered trains, but we're seeing hydrogen refueling capabilities in the bus industry, and frankly, that technology is eminently transferable to rail. In fact, probably sits easier in a rail depot than it does in a bus depot, frankly. So I think we are going to see turnkey rolling stock procurements. We're going to see the adoption of both battery and hydrogen technologies, and I think that will lend itself to turnkey solutions where the OEM provides long-term operation and maintenance and support. That's going to see maintenance teams from the train operating companies transferring to the OEMs, which we saw on Merseyside. And in fact, interestingly, on Merseyside, what happened there was that the maintenance function transferred from the TOC years before the new fleet was introduced, and actually the TOC, the OEM for the new fleet, therefore carried out maintenance on the old fleet for a number of years, and they're still carrying out maintenance now. And the reason for that was so that you didn't have a 2P transfer and all the IR issues and the pensions issues and everything that goes with that at the same time as you were actually introducing the new fleet, because that was considered to be far too much of a mouthful to bite off and be able to chew. So I think those issues, 2P, IR, and also, I mean, Rhianna will talk about this, I'm sure, but sort of the new regulatory issues that will surround the generation, storage, and use of hydrogen. The current regulation under the Gases Act was designed for the 19th century, not for today, where we're sticking hydrogen into vehicles and rolling them down the road or pushing them through tunnels on railway systems.
Thank you, Iain. I'm gonna stop you there if that's okay, because I'm conscious of time. But I think there's so much we can say on each of these limbs. I think there's a lot of content already building here for future sessions where we'll be able to explore these in a lot more detail. But if I can ask the panelists maybe to try and keep themselves to a minute or so for the rest of the questions, just so we can try and finish on time. It's good to see that a lot of us are picking up the Q&A as we go along, so we are addressing some of those, and I'd like to try and pick up one or two if we've got time, but if not, we'll pick them up separately. So if I can ask the same question to Frank in terms of UK bus and coach, maybe compare and contrast that a little to what Iain's just said. Yeah,
when doing my thinking and preparing for this session, I asked myself the question, why is diesel so significant to the transport sector? And doing a bit of research around this, I found a statement which essentially sets the bar, if you like, for what we have to achieve without diesel. And what I found was that the diesel engine is the most efficient prime mover commonly available today. So that sets the scene essentially, and it does mean that we've been able to enjoy travel by air, travel by rail long distances, and travel by bus and coach long distances. So that's what we're moving away from. And thinking about it in the context of bus and the fact that there will no longer be new vehicles coming into the market, certainly not by 240. where are we going with this then? Well, it's worth saying that over the past 2 or even more decades, the manufacturing industry has been dedicated to the task of driving down emissions. The bus manufacturing industry understands the issue and has been responding to it. There are internationally accepted standards known as the Euro standards, and they keep increasing in number. Most of the vehicles that are now available and in operation will probably be achieving Euro 5, and Euro 6 buses are available as well. And there's even been available technology to retrofit emission controls into existing vehicles, which means that not just newly manufactured vehicles meet the required standards, but on a retrofit basis, existing vehicles can move up, if you like, in terms of the standard and the quality when it comes to emissions. Now, this is an area where government has recognised it needs to intervene and ensure that an industry exists within the UK to deliver zero-emission buses and coaches. But how are they going to be powered? Well, I think as is clear already from what's been discussed in this session, particularly by Iain in the context of rail, we know that there are 2 certainly recognised sources of propulsion that are viable for vehicle propulsion, and that is obviously hydrogen and electric. And there's also what are called intermediate technologies, and I've seen a question about this, and that's the potential use of biofuel. And yes, obviously biofuel is also a way of propulsion. We have hybrid electric diesels at the moment, and that's obviously an intermediate way of getting towards lower emissions. The DfT's view of this matter at the moment is that they still seem to think that what should be the focus is that hydrogen is useful for longer journeys, with electric having much more limited ability in terms of the mileage that can be travelled. We know that that's to do with battery storage and the characteristics of the battery, and we know that there's an industry out there committed to ever increasing the quality and the characteristics of these batteries to make them suitable for longer distances. And Iain's referred to, I think it was Japan, where there are already trains being powered through batteries in a way that makes that something that we obviously have to keep in mind. But certainly the focus, and if you look at the Bus Back Better paper and everything that's being said about this at the moment, the Department for Transport is definitely focusing on hydrogen and electric as the means of going forward. But let's not forget biofuels, and what of course there needs to be, whether it is hydrogen, whether it is battery, or whether it is biofuel, there needs to be a way of getting the fuel to the actual vehicle. And of course, we're having to restructure in a number of ways to respond to this. The existence of charging points is something that is regularly in the news as something that's a major consideration. What we then need to think about is how the operators will respond to this, because as I said earlier, we have a private sector operated fleet of public service vehicles, so the investment decisions are with the operators. The government can influence these decisions through its funding decisions, and that's crucially important going forward, clearly. But how does a bus operator look at this? When they talk to the manufacturers, what are they expecting to see from the manufacturer? Within our transport team, we've spent quite a bit of time considering this, right through from how a bus can be brought into the market as an electric bus, and then how it can be financed, because many of the operators will look for external financing to cover investment costs involved. We find that bus operators are most interested in the total cost of operating the vehicle. And that approach has been responded to by manufacturers through the forming of partnerships. And so you have 2 of the most important operators in this country, Alexander Dennis and Wrightbus. They have formed partnerships with battery providers. And therefore, when an operator goes along and looks at its next fleet investment, it'll be looking at a situation where it has effectively got a turnkey solution in terms of the actual bus itself. As for the charging infrastructure, that of course can be part of the package as well, because that will be a significant investment and that needs to be financed as well. An issue for the Department of Transport.
Sorry, Frank. I hate to cut you off. I'm just conscious that we've kind of hit time, so can I give you a 30 seconds to finish, and then I'll close if that's okay.
Right. I think all I would say is that the issue for the Department for Transport is how access to new vehicles that are hydrogen or electric are going to be available to smaller operators, because they play a big part in the public transport service within this country as well. And I think the challenge that I've yet to see something really helpful on is how smaller operators will be helped to invest in new vehicles.
Thank you, Frank, and sorry for having to do that. I think we've clearly got a whole lot to say, and there's some more content we haven't been able to get to. We have picked up a lot of the Q&A, as I've said, but there's some more, we will address in future sessions. So watch this space, a lot more to follow. But I will wrap up there because I know we've all got to get on with our days. But I just want to say thank you to all of you for dialing in, listening to us chat through the journey to net zero for a sustainable transport system. Thank you to all of our panelists. We'll be sending around some links. Obviously, our details are on the website, so please do get in touch if there's any questions you have we haven't answered, or if you want to discuss in more detail any of us, anything we've covered this morning. As I said, check out our website, lots of stuff already on there. A new hydrogen page is launching soon with lots of materials and information. But on behalf of the panel, just thank you, and we look forward to hosting another session soon. Thank you.